Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our March Autism Consortium of Texas webinar, and we are going to give it a couple more minutes before we get started. Hi, folks. Welcome on. We're going to give it a couple minutes and then we'll pass it over to Dr. Zheng.
Feel free to use the chat to say hi and where you're from or where you are. Right, we have Vanessa from Killeen, Marcia from Fort Worth, Libby from Austin. Libby's a lead fellow. Great. Jennifer in San Antonio, Nydia in El Paso, and Maria in San Antonio. Stephanie. Yeah, Angela. And we got somebody from Houston, a couple of people from Houston and Tyler, Texas. That's great, reaching all over Texas. McAllen, New Orleans. There's somebody from New Orleans. Austin, Alamo, Texas. Excellent. Caroline, should we start now or wait till like 11:05?
Yeah, I
Let's
think we
start.
can go ahead and start. I see 71 people on, so that's a
Okay,
good
good.
number.
Yeah, awesome. Welcome, everybody, to the Autism Consortium of Texas. We're very excited to have our presenter for today, Shuting Zheng. She is a PhD and a BCBA, and she's also assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Dell Medical School here at UT Austin. And she works with us at Texas Center for Disability Studies on a number of projects. So we're excited to have her here in Austin. Shuting is a developmental scientist and board certified behavior analyst with expertise in assessment and behavioral treatment for children and youth with autism spectrum disorder. And her research interest is developed around the overarching theme of understanding developmental heterogeneity in autism and treatment individualization for individuals with autism. And her current research program focuses on understanding the influence of individual characteristics like biological sex, cognitive and language abilities, race, ethnicity, SES, socioeconomic status, on the measurement of autism symptoms and associated challenges, as well as identifying risk and resilience factors, both at the individual and contextual levels of psychological well-being and functional outcomes in autistic individuals through qualitative and quantitative research. And she also has received funding from private donors, but also NIH and Autism Science Foundation. So welcome, Shuting. We're really happy to hear you present.
Thank you, Sandy, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm so honored to be here to talk to the audience about this topic. And also, Caroline, thank you for coordinating. So like Sandy mentioned, my research sort of expand two areas. One's focused on symptom measures and the other is mental health. And today, I mostly focus on the mental health area and talk to you guys about some of the work we did in the past few years related to psychological well-being and mental health among autistic adolescents and young adults. So I have some learning objectives that I think just mainly the goal is for us to kind of get on the same page, describing and understanding the mental health needs. And I think I will be preaching to the choir. I think everybody here probably understand how important that is. And I will talk a little bit more about research findings we have over the past few years about influential life circumstances factors, how those related to psychological well-being and mental health, and also discuss some future directions. I want to start out with acknowledgement because I don't want to not have time to say this shout out. So my postdoc mentor, Summer Bishop, and close collaborators, Dr. Julie Taylor, Ryan Adams, they are key principal investigators in the research project I'm going to present today, and also some trainees that I have worked with along the way. Linnea Lepner, who is currently a student at Rogers, and China Parental. She still works as remotely on our projects, and Jackie Farrell, also a volunteer at UCSF. Of course, all the families and participants who share their data. These are funders I want to acknowledge, but let's dive right in. So I always like to start out with this slide to really emphasize how important it is to consider mental health while we serve the autistic population. I think a lot of you all will know already, autistic individuals are more likely to experience depression in their lifetime, and there are multiple reviews that's been done to report the prevalence rate of depression. I think it's a large range, but I think the highest was about 77% of lifetime depression rate. So that's really, really high and much higher than the general population. And also, there are dire consequences of depression in autism when it's not well treated or managed. Autistic individuals are 3 times more likely to attempt or die by suicide. So it's really important issue for us to consider. And we also know that poor mental health really gets in the way of individuals' everyday function. So we want to be able to figure out how we can best support psychological well-being in this population. And mental health has always been consistently identified as top research priority by the autism community. So there's a huge call from the community to wanting to have more knowledge generated as to how can we best support this population. But we also know from the literature the evidence for effective depression treatment is still limited, and specific treatment targets and mechanisms of change has not been well established to address depression specifically in autism. So our research is definitely wanting to contribute to this line of work. So what we did, and now it's a while back now, it's right before pandemic in March 2020, we launched a longitudinal study. We used the Spark Research Registry. I don't know people in the audience if they are familiar with the Spark. It's a national registry by Simons Foundation, where they recruit families all over the United States to provide basic information and genetic samples and to create a registry for researchers to be able to recruit from the registry of individuals who met their research criteria. So we were able to recruit 315 autistic youth and young adults who age 18 to 35. That's sort of the age range we aimed for. Just kind of wanting to focus on this transition age and see how things look like in this population first. So we end up with a sample that's about half male and female, which is quite common, I think, for a survey study that focuses on verbal and self-reporting autistic adults. We also have a pretty well-educated sample with 23% college degree and up, and a pretty high-functioning sample with 20% of them full-time employed and 32 part-time employed. So I want to give this descriptives about the sample just so that we can situate some of the findings I will share later in this larger context about who we are talking about here. So that's also sort of the limitations we'll face and with our findings because it's sort of not as generalizable to samples that's face more challenges such as cognitive and language impairments. So I want to lay the context from the beginning so we know. And as I mentioned, the survey was launched initially in March 2020. We were interested in understanding sort of the landscape out there about depression services, whether people are getting treated, what type of treatment they are getting for depression. We also collected a plethora of different mental health symptoms, including depression, anxiety, stress, and loneliness, and other life circumstances variables such as employment, whether they're engaging in social activities, how their sleep is, all those type of stuff, and relationship status as well. So that's how we launched the study. The purpose is really to understand the landscape of service they're receiving for depression. So from our first paper from this project, we saw that in our sample of 315 young adults, 47% of them scored above the clinical cutoff on depression measure. So that's basically meaning that about half of them actually have current elevated level of depression when we survey them. And a majority of them have been diagnosed with depression. So among the 47%, 83% of them have been diagnosed. So sort of meaning that we are doing an okay job of recognizing depression in this population and also doing an okay job to provide the diagnostic services related to depression in this population. And also, we also saw some sex difference as to whether someone will receive a depression diagnosis when they are depressed. So basically, females are more likely to receive a depression diagnosis. I think some of that may be related to the base rate of depression in the population and also possible some sex biases in how we are screening and diagnosing depression in males with autism, like kind of thinking about the measures we use, for example, the BDI, there are items about crying a lot. And we sort of all know like there are some sex-based norms or biases related to those type of specific behaviors we consider for diagnosis of depression. So we're not 100% surprised by that finding. And then we also look at who are more likely to receive treatment. So we ask them about whether they have received treatment in the past or whether they are currently receiving treatment. And we saw that people with a diagnosis are more likely to have received treatment, which is like makes sense, right? Because that's how our medical system is designed. You have to have a diagnosis to get through the treatment door. And also, we also see that people with higher education level tend to be more likely to receive depression treatment when they are reporting elevated level of depression. So that's also possibly indicating some sort of socioeconomic status-based disparities as to treatment access. So we also then look at what type of treatment they received. So of the about 60% of currently depressed individuals in the sample, about 60% of those currently depressed individuals in the sample were being in current treatment. And we can see a lot of them are getting medication treatment. And also a lot of them are getting individual therapy, especially for those with diagnosis. But those without diagnosis, there are way more people not receiving any type of treatment, which is consistent with the finding of diagnosis being related to treatment access. And it's also not surprising that medication seem to be more of the frequent treatment that they receive. But were the treatment helpful? So we also asked that question about their perceived helpfulness of those treatment they have. So we see that most autistic adults say that the treatment they're currently receiving are at least moderately helpful. So basically more than 80% say it's moderately helpful or very helpful or extremely helpful. So that's also a good sign, meaning that at least from their subjective perspective, something is working or being helpful to them when they are in treatment. But we also saw on average, our sample of autistic adults report to be in treatment for 5 to 6 years so far. So we asked a question about the duration of the treatment they've been in. So that's a little surprising to us because from what we know about the current medical system, it's really unsustainable to be in treatment for that long. And we also know there's increasing numbers of autistic adults, and many of them do experience mental health challenges. So how can we sustain the supply of qualified providers to support this population becomes a question when people actually need this type of long-term support. So we definitely have questions about why that is. Like, does it just mean people with autistic adults need more long-term support, or do we just sort of see the treatment not as effective for them to graduate? Or do we actually need to intervene early because maybe it's because their depression become pretty persistent once they are in adult and their learning patterns have been more, fixed due to the long, persistent depression they're experiencing, then it's harder to move the needle to make them feel better for them to graduate from treatment. So we have a lot of questions about this type of thing. And so we decided to explore further of looking at whether those treatment actually is working and do we need more effective treatment targets. But before we do that, we also ask them about treatment barriers because as we know, about 40% of our sample who are reporting current levels of elevated depression are not receiving any treatment at the time we survey them. So what's going on with those individuals? Why are they not getting the support they need? So we did ask the question, what are the barriers they're experiencing when they are trying to seek treatment or support for their depression? So about 60 of the adults in the survey reported they are experiencing barriers. Some of them just didn't answer that question because we made it optional. And out of the 60, 54 of them actually told us a bit more about what type of barrier they have. So we coded all the responses qualitatively. And the table here shows you the top 10 barriers they experienced. So not surprisingly, the top barrier they identify is related to financial issues. So this is one quote I really like from one of the participants. They were talking about how they had a therapist before and was in treatment, but then when they become unemployed, they cannot afford to continue the long-term therapy, especially because their insurance doubled without employment and all that stuff. So it's notable that how insurance and employment can really play a role in what type of services people may be able to access. And also quite a few of them talked about the fit with the therapist and also professionals' lack of understanding of what it means to be depressed and also autistic. And also some endorsed challenges with logistics of like scheduling, transportation, and also challenges related to how to describe the problem and explain what they're experiencing to the therapist. So there's definitely barriers from the sample we surveyed. So this is what I want to kind of summarize what we talked about so far so people have clear takeaways in their mind. So what we learned so far, we learned that depression rate in autistic adults is high, right? We saw 50% of them report current depression and 80% of those actually were diagnosed. And also, treatment takes a long time. People are in treatment for a long time, and then also quite a few of them are not able to get treatment. So there are barriers to accessing treatment. So how can we try to figure out how we best support this sample? Because it's especially looking at the high rate, I think none of us can just say case closed and we can move on. I think it just bothers me to see how many of them doesn't actually get the effective support they need. So we did a qualitative study. So we just want to know what actually make them happy and unhappy because we figure that could be potential targets for treatment or considerations of treatment, right? Like maybe we, from like general sense, like if we increase more of the happy experiences and reduce unhappy experiences, maybe that way we can improve psychological well-being and mental health in general. So we asked those questions to autistic adults. And from the qualitative analysis, we saw that a lot of them say their source of happiness are from their social partner, including family members, friends, colleagues. So people talk about that a lot. But also, social partners tend to be the top areas or top source of unhappiness as well, which I think just speaking of real life experiences of our own, it's not surprising, right? Like people, like family members we love give us happiness, but sometimes they also drive us crazy, right? So I think it's not surprising in that way. We also saw that individuals really talked about different type of activities they can engage in, like hobbies, and also interacting with their pets seem to be a big topic people tend to talk about. And social interaction is definitely a source of happiness as well. But then also remember the survey we did was around March 2020, and we all know what happened at that time. So there's the presidential election, there's also the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of current events seem to be on people's mind as well to be the source of unhappiness or stress. And also employment job seem to be another big one that people talked about. So kind of keeping this in mind, we also want to explore the relationships of this type of experience specifically with our data and to see if we can have some quantitative evidence as well about beyond the qualitative responses we see from this population. So we launched to do more studies and analysis. So since we were during COVID, since we have our first survey right before COVID, right? So we did our study beginning of March 2020. So we decided we need to follow up with them. So we did another survey with the same sample in May 2020. And we actually saw that a lot of them reported loss of job or reduction in the worked hours in our autistic adult sample. And those people reported higher depression in May 2020, basically 10 weeks after we first surveyed them. They already showing some worsening mental health challenges. I think this is also not surprising to all of us who experienced that pandemic together. It's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of job-related stressors moving from in-person to remote, a lot of transitions and changes, and specifically those hypo job losses and reductions that also may bring financial strain really had a negative impact on people's mental health. And then we also look further about those when we ask them about whether they have been fired or terminated their employment by employer before. And a lot of them endorse that they have had that experience and looking at what are the reasons they told us about their employment termination, because we now know that employment is a really important factor to consider for depression. A lot of them actually attribute the reason of being fired or terminated employment to be internal. So as you see in the bar chart on the left-hand side, like people talked about work performances, how they have social challenges to interact with coworkers, their attendance, their mental health, Some even said their bad behavior. Like a lot of it, they're attributing to themselves. And I think from the organizational psychology literature and employment literature, we know that when people are internally attributing some of the employment related challenges, it actually have a strain on their mental health as well, because then you're really blaming yourself and then that makes you feel worse. So that's sort of the employment finding we had. Then we also look at social experiences because, again, we're really interested in figuring out what are the factors that actually contribute to worse mental health and higher levels of depression, right? So we look at employment, and the other thing we look at is social experiences. So we asked all our participants about amount of the time they spend in certain activities, including hanging out with friends, hanging out with family members, talking to friends on the phone, going to social or community-based activities such as going to church or community events, and also doing solitary activities such as being alone, listening to music or hobby, those type of things, right? And we also ask them about what they perceive of the amount of time they spend. So there are two levels of question, thinking about the frequency of time they spend in different types of activities, and also perception of that amount of frequency. And what we found was very interesting at the time to us is that it's actually not about the absolute amount they spend with people or with friends or socially. It's really the feelings about spending too little time with friends or socially that is associated with depression. So, sort of thinking about we all have different personal needs and preference of being with others. And when you feel like that need is not being met, or you feel like you're spending too little time with friends or with others socially, then you are really more likely to develop higher levels of mental health challenges. And also, we saw that people who are also feeling lonely, that variable also mediated the association between perception of time spent socially and depression, meaning that those who feel like they're spending too little time with friends or socially are more likely to have felt lonely, and feeling lonely also are associated with depression. So the relationship is really mediated by the feeling of loneliness. So that really highlights we need to consider personal needs and preference when we talk about asking people to be more social, right? That's sort of sometimes the blanket recommendation we have for social skills training, especially. Like we really aim to increase the amount of social experience in autistic individuals, but oftentimes neglect to ask them, is this what you want? Do you desire more social interaction? We really need to take their voice and preferences and perspectives into consideration when we design these type of interventions targeting social experience. Yeah. So again, kind of pause here to think about what we learned so far from this analysis we did in different papers we wrote. So basically, we have this cross-sectional data to really think about what are the life experience variables that's associated with depression, right? So we saw that employment seemed to matter. Also, the perception of why their employment was terminated seemed to matter. And I also saw that social experiences seem to matter, especially one's perception of whether they're spending enough time with friends seem to really matter, and whether they're feeling lonely or not seem to matter. But these are all so far cross-sectional data or two time points of data that we're talking, which is not really sufficient when we think through a study design perspective, right? It doesn't tell us really which is causing what, right? So it could be that they're more depressed, so they tend to feel more negative about their social experience and feeling like they could have or should have spent more time, but they really don't have the energy to interact with friends or with others socially. Or it could be that when they are not interacting sufficiently with friends to their level of preference, then they feel like more depressed. So we really need the longitudinal data to help us tease apart the associations and understand better which comes first and which comes later. So that's why we really saw more funding to follow up with this cohort we had, where we, as I mentioned, we launched the first survey with the sample in March 2020 and follow up short term right after pandemic outbreak in May 2020. So, and then we saw funding to follow them for more time points. But as how real world research project goes, fundings are really, a hit or miss sometimes, and that's why you see our time points are not very well aligned. It's just more we are scrambling resources to try to get the data. We think that's very important. So in the end, we have around 174 individuals who completed all time points. So that's already a relatively large sample with longitudinal data that we're talking about in autistic adult literature. So we're very happy with that. And we definitely capitalize on the data we have to try to understand the longitudinal course of depressive symptoms in adults. So kind of looking back to the timeline again, at the end, we really have 5 time points spanning over 2 years, right? So from March 2020 to March to April 2022. So that allows us to do more analysis that's looking at the trajectory and change over time. So one thing when we look at longitudinal data is we want to see both the within individual change, meaning how one individual change over time, but also the between individual differences. That means how different people are changing differently over time. So when we look at the data with multi-level modeling, we really see there's a large between individual variances. So basically, if you will, of all the variances we see in depression symptoms over time, about 73 of them were from between individual. So that means it's, again, the heterogeneity problem that we're seeing in autism, where individuals, even though we tend to sort of recruit a relative homogeneous sample for this study already, where everybody are able to self-report, consent, and complete surveys online, still we see a huge difference from individual to individual, where they report their depression symptoms very differently over time. I think that's something that, as people who practice in the field, we all know that when you meet one individual with autism, you meet one individual with autism, right? It seems to be the same case when you work with one individual, autistic individual with depression. That's just a specific case you're treating, and things you know from this case may not always be generalizable to other cases you may have in the future, just because how variable and how heterogeneous this sample is. But we do see some group level patterns when we look at the data. So for example, we see in general, the trend seems to be increasing over time in self-reported depressive symptoms. So this, we were only able to collect the depression and anxiety stress scale, which is a DAS. That's referenced here over all 5 time points. So we see there's a increase on the plot on the right hand side, even though the line seems to be a pretty flat line, the changes are statistically significant. And you see the whiskers of the line plot; those are basically the standard deviations of the DAS score on depression subscale. You see there's huge variance. Again, that's kind of confirming what I was talking about earlier, the large between individual variance we see over time in self-reported depressive symptoms. I don't think I can stress this point enough. It's just like the heterogeneity is really, really key for us to consider when we look at these things in the autistic sample. When we look at predictors of change of their longitudinal trajectory, we also see that those with depression history, so basically when they told us at baseline to say, okay, I was diagnosed with depression before that variable, and those with lower annual household income tend to report higher levels of depressive symptoms. So basically, I think that's to be expected as well, right? Like when someone had a depression history, it's more likely they are more reactive to or more susceptible to different stressors in life and are more vulnerable to mental health challenges in the future as well. And there have been tons of literature in the general population to show how lower SES is also associated with poorer mental health outcomes. So we are seeing here in this autistic sample. I think what's more interesting or important I want to share with the group today is that so in order to try to look at longitudinal change over time and how different life factors associated with depression, we created a variable, what we call the school work activities variable. Basically, remember we saw that how employment reduction of the first two time point predicted increased depressive symptoms, right? So we really want to look at that. But then there are some in our sample who are still in college and are not working. So we want to account for that social interactions and day-to-day activities sort of structure. So we combined if they are either in working or in school. So anyone who have some sort of engagement with school activity or work related activity, we combine them to say, okay, you have some sort of structured daytime activity that you are required to show up and interact with people, right? So we created that variable because we are interested to see if that type of structure and daily exposure to other people and interaction might be useful to think about mental health in this population. So we did see statistically significant findings for this variable. What we saw is that those autistic adults who are engaged in work or school tend to report lower levels of depressive symptoms. So basically means that if you're doing something structured or required, basically, right, by school work, you're more likely to have better mental health. Um, and when we look at the multi-level model, we also saw that those who have higher depression symptoms at the start of the study are more reactive to changes in schoolwork. So basically, those who reported higher symptoms at baseline, if they gained work or school engagement, their depression goes down faster or more drastically compared to those with lower levels of depression to begin with. I know it's sort of a little several terms in logic, but basically it means that if you have high levels of depression, any changes in life, you're more likely to be reactive to either the stressor or the protective factor. And then since we have looked so far of the longitudinal causes of depression, and also find some interesting findings of related factors, we're also thinking about, okay, we have made all these assumptions about what might be important for mental health and for thinking about what type of support they need, what type of activities they possibly can engage in. We also were thinking at the time of like, we're talking about figuring out the support and specific mechanisms or treatment target that we can use in depression treatment or mental health support with autistic adults. But we also need to understand from their perspective, what are the resilience factors or what are the risk factors from their own perceived way are important to consider when they consider themselves. So we also then ask the question of themselves, about what are their perceived strengths and primary difficulty at the time, because sort of thinking about how we support someone for mental health, right? We always want to start out building strengths-based models that target their top problems. So that's sort of what's motivating this research question, trying to figure out what are their self-reported strengths that we can possibly think together about capitalizing on, and also what are the top difficulties we should really figure out treatment to tackle so that downstream we can improve mental health and psychological well-being in this sample. So we got free text responses from 295 autistic adults, and we also did qualitative coding to generate themes to see what are the things that we got from the autistic individuals. So we created some word cloud to just make it visually easy to see for everybody. So a lot of them endorse that being creative, smart, intelligent, kind, caring, loving, and being perseverant, being resilient as their top strengths. And I think this is just goes to show you that a lot of individuals, autistic individuals, really do recognize their unique personalities and recognize how they are connecting with people and those skills to be of their strengths. And I think we should not make assumptions about what I think some of the literature called autistic strengths, right? Like I think there are a lot of stereotypes and specific jaded way of thinking, okay, detail orientation or like, special interest, those type of things. I mean, our sample do endorse those things as well, but what popped out as the top strengths that they talk about are actually quite interpersonal, right? Being kind, loving, and caring. And some of them say they are good friends and they are able to keep good relationships and being loyal to people and their friends. So those type of things I think are often neglected when we try to identify their strengths from our own assumptions rather than asking autistic adults themselves. So I think this is trying to our attempt to move towards more neurodiversity affirming sort of support when thinking about psychological well-being. And also when they talk about challenges, again, some of the similar patterns we see from the literature that's emerged in our sample as well. A lot of them talk about challenges with executive function, which sort of make me think about some of the barriers they endorse for assessing depression treatment related to logistics, scheduling, figuring out and organizing transportation to get to and from the therapy. Those type of things are all tied to executive function as well, right? And also the finding we had about engagement in everyday activities related to work and school. You really need high level of executive function to be able to manage to do that and show up every day, right? Like how to overcome that and have that opportunity is very important for us to consider when we say like, okay, we need to increase their engagement in those type of activities that's more structured and required and have the social exposure. But also recognize it could be challenging for some individuals to be able to do that. And socializing is another thing people talk a lot about as their challenges. Financial challenges pop up again, mental health challenges. So this is really goes to show the exercise we did to see how can we incorporate autistic voices in thinking about best supporting this population. So I want to pause here again to kind of bring us back to what we have learned so far. So again, we need to improve access and quality, right? Based on the findings we have about the number of people that doesn't have access and also the barriers and the long duration they have to be in treatment. We also saw that, again, the large variability, right, we observe across individuals and how can we as clinicians and researchers really start to tackle that problem of heterogeneity and consider the individual differences in their risk and resilience and response to stressors is very important, right? Kind of thinking about our finding of how the available resources to them, such as household income and their what they come with, right? Their depression history, all those factors do come together to influence how their experience is for their psychological well-being. And also kind of look at the workout I just showed you guys, kind of their personal perceptions of themselves, right? What their strengths are and their difficulties are. We really need to talk through those things with our specific clients or the participants to figure out what are the best way to support them. And then those type of things I talked about already. And I think the other highlight I really want to point out is all our sort of research and analysis I showed you so far is coming through from the angle of, okay, we really think their everyday experience and life circumstances, the larger context of one's life really matter. And some are stressors and some could be protective. And how can we best capitalize that is very important. So this line of research I'm showing you today is really trying to jump out of the typical medical model where we like, if someone have a depression diagnosis, we treat them with SSRI or something like that, right? We're really trying to think about, okay, we can give them medication, we can put them in psychosocial therapy, but what are the other factors that's contributing to them? How can we really take the time to understand the individual better before we jump to the conclusion of this is what you need, right? So this is where we are coming from and also where we try to get to with this line of research. Again, we really want to emphasize a point. We need to listen to autistic individuals, listen to their perspectives on their preference. Do they want to be more social now? Listen to their strengths or self-perceived strengths and think together with them, how can we capitalize on those strengths to really work to improve other areas they perceive to be challenges. So really the neurodiversity affirming way of supporting them. And then, so this is sort of like what we talked about so far, always this sample of autistic young adults, right? Looking at different time points, looking at data longitudinally, but we still feel like we're a little unsatisfied because we're only getting snapshots of the times when we talk to them, like those measures mostly ask about like how do you feel in the past 2 weeks, right? It's very broad in a way that we're asking them for a lump sum impression of how they are doing. We feel unsatisfied because like when we are working with individuals in therapy or in treatment, we're really focusing on what they are experiencing today or yesterday and how different experiences on a daily basis kind of accumulate together and contribute to how one's overall status of well-being, right? So that's why doctors Julie Taylor, Summer Bishop, and Ryan Adams, they applied for a grant to employ this type of daily diary-based study. So what we call in this project is called the end-of-day reports. So basically, we asked autistic youth, 15 to 25-year-old, every day for 7 days at the end of day 9 p.m. every day to report what happened during that day. So we specifically prompt for different windows of reporting, like kind of thinking about before 9 a.m., 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., 12 p.m. to 3, 3 to 6, 6 to 9. During each of those windows, what did you do? And what's the longest activity you were engaging in? Were you interacting with someone? How was the interaction and how did you feel? So those are the type of questions we ask as part of this DoD-funded project. What we saw and what we're interested in is to look at whether social interactions and participation really make a difference in mental health in this transition age youth, because kind of back to what I presented to you guys earlier about autistic adults, how their the frequency of social social engagement matters less than their perception of the engagement. So we want to kind of take that to more of the within day micro level of the specific interactions they had and how that's related to their feelings. So you see here on the right-hand side, I have this density plot showing you basically different types of social context. So the red line is alone, and the blue line is they are with someone but not interacting with someone, and the green line is when they are interacting with someone. And then the x-axis is the positive affect. So when we run the models, we actually saw that when individuals or autistic youth, 15 to 25 years old, when they report they're interacting with someone during the specific time during the day, they are more likely to then report both more positive mood and more negative mood compared to when they are alone. Sorry, it's very limited information, so I will say that again. So basically, when we compare when they're interacting with someone to when they are alone, we see a higher level of positive feelings such as happy, pleasant, and also a higher level of negative feelings such as sad and angry. I think in the way it makes sense, especially kind of looking at the general population literature too. When you are actually interacting with someone, you are actually more likely to both experience the positive feedbacks you're getting, right? But also possible interpersonal conflict that may have a negative impact on your mental health or feelings at the time, right? So that's kind of coming back to understanding how social interaction and social participation may influence how we feel and how we experience for psychological well-being and mental health, is that it could be a double-sided sword, double-edged sword. And this is also consistent with when we asked the autistic adults, what are your sources of happiness and unhappiness? I'm sure some of you remember we also have both social interactions under the top themes of happiness and the top themes of source of unhappiness. So this is sort of confirming that quantitatively with the micro level data of everyday experiences. And then for me, I'm still like a little unsatisfied with this because we were thinking about, okay, this is 15 to 25, still a large age range, right? Thinking back to the heterogeneity we observe, and also the developmental impact of transition that's captured by this, but then it's like a lot of different stages of transition involved. And also this is asking people to report end of day for the whole day. What about if we can get real-time responses of what they're experiencing? So that's why we look further as to whether we can get those even more specific data. And the other thing we look at the data for is we also look at when they first got your depression diagnosis, and we also saw that most of them are frequently diagnosed around 14 to 16, tend to be like your late pubertal stage or post-pubertal stage, sort of the mental window, and again, the heterogeneity. So we have to be more precise in thinking about how we understand depression in autism. So that's why we are now running a study at UT, thinking about narrowing in age range where most people report their first depression diagnosis, 14 to 16, and also kind of thinking about how individual differences really differ by their context and individual factors. And we know autistic adolescent girls really have different experiences compared to males, like later diagnosed. There are many evidence showing that, and higher burden of mental health, especially during puberty, as shown by many general population literature, and also emergent literature to show sex differences of how autism is experienced. So kind of combining these different factors, I really want to focus on adolescent girls with autism during the age of 14 to 16. And what we are doing differently this time is we are asking them to tell us in real time what they're experiencing. So basically, they get pings every day for 4 times on the app, and then report for 7 straight days of their social interaction with individual, whether they're actually receiving support or conflict. So we are specifying the type of interaction as well, and then asking about how they're feeling and whether they feel like they need to regulate or cope with their emotions and whether their strategies they used were successful. So kind of really disentangling all the different aspects of social and emotional experiences during this specific age range within this specific population. So this is what we're doing now, and we are hoping that with this effort, we then get more comprehensive profiles of how they're experiencing every day to really inform targets for intervention. Or, and the next line of research is trying to identify if there are triggers we can actually target just in time to provide the support they need as things are happening. So kind of thinking about how can we combine the traditional psychotherapy with more technology-based treatment strategies to support them. So this is what we are doing right now. And I also posted our study flyer, just selfishly use this platform to promote this study as well. So we're looking for both girls with and without autism to participate in the study to help us understand better what type of and what kind of autistic experience that is actually influential and matters for thinking about mental health and how can we best support this population. So this is what we're doing now. And I was told I should end around 12 so that we leave time for questions and comments from the audience. So I'm gonna pause here because I feel like I've talked a lot and want to leave time for questions and comments and discussion. So I'm gonna stop sharing so we can see everybody's faces. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Well, we do have some questions in the Q&A. Some came in, some are coming in. So our first question is, have there been any research on trends of mortality statistics related to co-occurring mental health conditions for autistic individuals? And if so, have things been improving or getting worse?
So I'm not fully aware of the looking at the mortality trends, but I think there have been studies about rates, like specifically rates of individuals, like deaths by suicide. Most of those were from, I think, Northern European countries where they have population-based studies. I think there's one from Swedish population cohort looking at the rate of suicidality and the deaths by suicide. And I think so there was a Denmark one, and then there was a Sweden one. I think the Sweden one that's more recent, I think it was 2 years ago or something. I can also find reference to send out later. The rate was a little bit higher than when the Denmark one that was published about 10 years ago now. So I think if we take different studies together, even though we're talking about different samples and different countries and different contexts, we do see a little bit of increase. But I think I like the point of maybe there should also be the trend analysis to really look at over time within the similar sample population. Do we see an increase? I think right now I'm just not aware of any that have done that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question. So why is it not surprising that medication is the primary treatment for autistic adults diagnosed with depression? Are there any longitudinal studies regarding medication use for depression in autistic individuals and their efficacy? And another one, are there any correlations made between levels of depression and diet or exercise for these individuals?
Yeah, I love all the questions. Yeah, so I think I was making this comment of like, oh, it's not surprising that the medication is the primary treatment. So I think the reason I said that is one, we know that like medication is very highly used in this population, and there are more, I think, accumulating literature around how I think that's called like polypharmaceutical.
Mhm.
Sorry about my lack of vocabulary to describe that. Basically means autistic individuals are on multiple medications at certain given time points. So just like the high rate of medication use in this sample make me not surprised that a lot of individuals are reporting they are having medication treatment for their depression. And I think the other reason is that we had hypothesized that since a lot of individuals with autism diagnosis already, oftentimes, if they have the resources, they're connected with a psychiatrist. And when they bring up depression and when they're diagnosed with depression, so although the first line of treatment with a psychiatrist, they would consider medication as an option. But I do agree where I think we still need a lot of good clinical trials to show evidence of medication efficacy in autistic individuals, especially for treating depression, right? I think there's still a lack of good, high quality trials to show that, especially high quality trials with large samples. I think we need that as a field to really help us understand that better. And let alone to say longitudinal studies to follow individuals to see how medication plays a role in the long run. Like we don't even have good, I think, clinical trials to show how medication actually works in a large sample of autistic individuals yet. So I think that's definitely the direction we should go. I think the last question about correlations between levels of depression and diet and exercise is a very interesting one because I'm working on a grant to look at physical activity level and depression and mental health in this sample. So I think there was one or two studies that I'm aware of looking at physical activity related to like cognitive decline or neurodegenerative disease. But I haven't seen one that's directly targeting exercise or diet, even to look at its association with depression. But I think the other thing I want to bring up related to that question is thinking about behavior activation therapy, where we have some preliminary evidence, I think, to show that behavior activation therapy might be useful treatment for depression and mental health in adults with autism. And one of the strategies of behavior activation therapy is to activate you, either getting you outside or doing things that's enjoyable and pleasant. And I would like to add a component of that to think about being physically active as well, and how that could be potentially beneficial. And I think there's just mountains of evidence of showing how physical activity is helpful for both physical and mental health. And I think we need to do that in our population as well to show that with good data. Yeah.
Great. Another question, has sexual activity been included in social experiences for autistic individuals, or is that a separate statistic? And has there been any data gathered regarding its correlation with depression diagnosis and treatment efficacy?
Mm. So sexual activity, I don't think, especially for our study, we didn't include that in our social experiences. Um, The only question we had the entire study that's related to sexual activity is from the BDI, the Back Depression Inventory. There's a question about increase or decrease sexual interest as an indicator for someone's depression. But we didn't look at that specifically. And I think there's still, yeah, lack of data to show its association with other things. Yeah. So.
Thank
What's
you.
the other question? Sorry.
Yeah, no, and oh, within that
Yeah, I thought there
same
was a part two.
question, yes, there was. And then has there been any data gathered regarding its correlation with depression diagnosis and treatment efficacy?
Um, I'm not aware. Yeah, but it could also be my ignorance. So, yeah.
All right, and then we have a question from Elizabeth. Did either study examine rates of masking during social interactions, and in parentheses, the comfort of social interactions for autistic people, or how masking and other environmental factors, for example, sensory sensitivities, relate to depression?
Yeah, that's such a good question. We did not, unfortunately. I think one of the challenge is we don't have a good measure of camouflaging or masking yet in autism. I know there have been debates in the literature about how we best measure it, and we do have a measure available, but I think the psychometrics of that measure is still questionable. I think it's the CATI. But yeah, so we did not include masking measures in our study. But I think the other thing I'm working on right now is to think about autistic burnout and how masking, camouflaging during social interactions could associate with autistic burnout and how autistic burnout is similar or contributing to depression, or how is that different as a construct that we should consider in thinking about mental health. So definitely important factors to consider, I think, when we talk about psychological well-being in general. But I think the research and the field is still very much in infancy, if you will, or really trying to get there. Yeah. So if you have good thoughts, Elizabeth, about doing a study related to that area, feel free to reach out and happy to chat more about that too. And the sensory sensitivities one is also a good one. We don't collect those factors right now. And I think, especially for the studies we're doing experience sampling, that could be a good one to consider in the future because, like, for the specific type of experience they are reporting, are they experiencing some sensory difficulties? Yeah. But yeah, sorry. The short answer is we don't have data yet related to that.
Yeah, and I'll just point out, Elizabeth is one of our Len trainees. She's in the self-advocate discipline. So great to have you, Liz. All right, for our next question, for your adolescent girl study, are you gathering any data on gender dysmorphic feelings associated with depression?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Stephanie. So for the adolescent girl study, we're only recruiting girls who are assigned female at birth and self-identify as female. So that sort of yeah. So we chose to do that for the reason being we want to have a relatively homogeneous sample so that we can really target the question of social experiences within that cisgender female sample. And also that's acknowledging how gender dysphoric feelings are actually very important for considering mental health, right? Because how, especially during adolescence, a lot of them are figuring out what they identify with and their identity development and how the fitting in or not feeling like a misfit would really, really influence how they approach basically everything in their life, right? So that's why we want to control for that variable to only include girls who are cisgender at this point. But we do have some other data from other projects, like the one I mentioned about Dr. Taylor, Bishop, and Adams were leading. We did see that individuals who are gender diverse, I can also include that reference to Caroline. So individuals who are gender diverse tend to report more symptoms, especially when they report challenges with friendship. So it's sort of like a mediated relationship again, but definitely there are emergent literature about how gender identity may play a role in how
Yeah, if you want to send me that article, I can definitely include it with my
yeah.
email I send out afterwards.
Mhm.
Um, from Barbara, do you have data on autism diagnoses, particularly among girls, that occur among teens that are already diagnosed with depression?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So like sort of the diagnostic overshadowing as well, right? Like their pathway to either an autism diagnosis or to a mental health diagnosis such as depression. So for the autistic adult sample, we did look at that to see whether their depression diagnosis were before their autism diagnosis. I think about 10 people, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on the number. It's been a while, but there's a very small number of the sample that actually reported depression diagnosis before their autism diagnosis. But when we were running our growth study, interestingly, a lot of the adolescent girls we end up recruiting, especially for the pilot study that's wrapped up already, had a mental health crisis before their autism diagnosis. So basically, they had a mental health crisis, and someone looked at them to say, "Oh, maybe you have autism." So that's sort of a lot of the girls in our pilot studies pathway to get their autism diagnosis. So for those girls, mental health diagnosis or depression, anxiety diagnosis come before their autism diagnosis. And I think just putting out there my positionality as a researcher, I think those girls will be very different from the girls we talk about who have an autism diagnosis at 2 or 3, and then later on experience more mental health challenges. So I think as a field, we really need to have better delineation of like, okay, this is the type of sample we are talking about. I think that's also why I was trying to be very clear of the sample we are talking about in the beginning of my talk. But I think definitely like thinking about the diagnostic overshadowing of possible autism overshadowing other mental health, like everything or all the difficulties they are experiencing being attributed to their autism, or vice versa, right? Not autism not being considered for girls when they are actually when they already have other mental health diagnosis is also challenging. So yeah, so I think it's definitely a very interesting question to consider. And yes, we do have quite some teenage girls who come with depression diagnosis and then got an autism diagnosis later on. Yeah.
All right, thank you. We have a question here from Risha. How do rates of depression and other mental health conditions compare between verbal and nonverbal autistic individuals? And is there enough research on nonverbal individuals to understand their mental health?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Risha. Yeah, so for the first question about the rates between verbal and nonverbal, I think so far the literature I think have been showing that individuals with higher cognitive abilities are more likely to have mental health or depression diagnosis. And there have been a lot of hypotheses around why. But yeah, so yes, there is difference. And yes, those with verbal abilities or higher cognitive abilities tend to have a higher rate. But again, I don't think we know exactly why. It could be that we're not, like the second part of the question, we're not actually capturing the mental health challenges of those who are nonverbal because we rely heavily on self-report measures when we are trying to determine a mental health diagnosis. Like all the studies I show you today focus on those who can self-report, right? So in itself, it's a very biased sample, right? Because we're not including those who are not self-reporting. And so we also have another study where we are trying to look at mental health in those with more limited cognitive ability. So we define it by IQ below 70. Um, and then we were only able to collect parent or proxy report about their mental health. And it feels very unsatisfying, right? Because like you are basically relying on someone else to extrapolate the individual's internal feelings. I mean, a lot of the parents know their kids very well, right? But still, we are still lacking a way to be able to capture nonverbal individuals' internal status that's relevant to mental health diagnosis. So I think that's sort of yeah, where we need more research and also figuring out how we define mental health in nonverbal individuals, like especially given so far our diagnosis of depression is so highly reliant on self-report. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A question from Jennifer. Is there any data about best type of therapy for depression in autistic adults? Also, any data about knowledge about autism in providers that contribute to outcomes?
Yeah, that's also a really, really good question. So I think about the best type of therapy for depression, I'm not aware of any comparative efficacy studies yet about different types of therapy for depression in autistic adults. I think we are still catching up as a field to figure out what actually are therapy or treatment that can work, right? So we're still at that stage of figuring out what might work. And I think once we have a better sense of what might work, I think then the next step is figuring out what's the best option. And I think that probably like just kind of knowing autism and the heterogeneity of autism, there's probably no one size fit all, right? Like I think we will have to sort of consider what works best for whom. And then who are the responders, like say to medication best, and who are the responders who benefit from, like say CBT or DBT better compared to getting them on medication. Like I think there's just a lot of nuances in kind of thinking about the individualized approach for tailoring support for autistic individuals. Yeah. And sorry, I think there's a second part about provider knowledge.
Yeah.
I think it's the literature so far. There are quite some qualitative studies talking about how providers do not feel very equipped to help treat depression or mental health challenges in autistic individuals. And a lot of them talk about how they feel like there's a lack of training for them about how to do the best therapy for their autistic clients when they show up with mental health challenges. So I think that itself sort of provides some insights around like their self-perceived competency and how that might influence the therapeutic alliance between the provider and the client. I think all that we know already contribute to outcomes, right? Or response to treatment. And from our qualitative data about the barriers, some of them also talk about how they just feel like their therapist is not a good fit and how that becomes a barrier for them to seek out more therapy or seek out better treatment because they just don't know where to find the right person for them. Yeah, so I think that definitely contribute to the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved your point about the heterogeneity of autism and not having a one size fits all therapeutic intervention. Absolutely. Next, we do have a few comments in the chat. We have one from Benny. Hey, Benny, how are you? So let's see. I find it interesting that sleep is so tiny and the challenge is word cloud. So that was that word cloud that you showed.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
absolutely.
I think some of them are lumping it under the co-occurring mental health challenges, I would assume. And also, I think so. We also actually did have a separate paper I can include in the package Caroline you sent out too. We did analyze sleep, so we asked them to report about their sleep the past week, sort of give us like estimates of their sleep quality, time they went to sleep, time they wake up. Like, so we did a bunch of analysis and we did find the sleep quality are pretty poor in this sample. I don't think it's surprising to anyone here. And especially sleep efficiency seemed to be a key variable that's relevant for thinking about depression. So we found significant associations between the lack of sleep efficiency or low sleep efficiency related to higher levels of depression in our sample. And in our autistic adolescent study right now, the girl study, we are also giving feedback to all the girls to have some objective sleep data and also for their experience sampling every morning they report about their sleep. And from our pilot data analysis, we do see sleep efficiency being associated with the overall levels of energy and also overall levels of mood rating. Yeah. So I agree with you. It's too small in the word cloud. It's
Yeah.
more important than that.
Yes. And then a comment from Meredith Brinster, just saying they have to hop off, but a great talk. And thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Meredith.
And then we have a question from Leo. They've said, building on the point about friendship difficulties contributing to depression for gender diverse youth, do you see the tipping point between helpful connection and social overload working differently for girls, uh, trans or gender diverse youth, and other marginalized people? I am curious about moderators like safety and rejection.
Wow, that's such a good question. Yeah, because I think you're absolutely right. Like too much or too little seems to be not good either. Like either of those it doesn't seem to be beneficial, right? So in the analysis I shared about like their preference of social interaction, basically with too little or too much and about right. So we did have all levels, right? Only the too little came out to be significantly influencing how one's depressive levels are. So from that data specifically, it seems like too little is more a concern compared to too much. But I totally see the point of where overload or overburden would be a problem. So I did a whole bunch of interviews with all our pilot study adolescent girls. There were 10 of them with autism. I talked to their caregivers and themselves extensively. And one of the things they bring up a lot is this, again, the autistic burnout piece and then the social overload piece. So many of them endorse like they have to decompress in their room for hours after coming back from school for a whole day. So kind of thinking about whether that's too much, right? Like what's the mechanisms for helping them either decompress or kind of come back to their baseline feeling okay. I think it's something we still need to explore more. And the question about the marginalized group or transgender or gender diverse youth, I think is a very important one too. Kind of thinking about, yeah, the interpersonal safety and the belongingness to their peer group and also the sometimes intentional exclusion of them in peer group and how that all influence their social experience and then downstream mental health. I think is an important area to focus. Just unfortunately, we only focusing on cisgender females in our study, but again, one colleagues are doing some work related to that. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we don't have any more questions or comments in either the Q&A or the chat. I'm gonna give people maybe a couple more minutes if you have any lingering questions or comments. And then we are at 12:22, so after those few minutes, I will go ahead and end our webinar.
Okay.
Yes,
Also, just post my email in the chat in case people think of anything else. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to yeah, chat with any of you about different things. Yeah. And like I mentioned before, Caroline, I will send you all the papers I mentioned this during the talk and also the one with the transgender and gender diverse youth. Yeah.
great. That would be great. And I will go ahead and I'll send that out to everybody who was on the webinar today.
That's awesome. And I feel like you'll really have a best crowd. I really enjoyed all the questions. It's so nice to see like people are thinking about this similar topics and share similar interest.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we have some wonderful attendees every single time. We get lots of really good questions.
I should come more to this as attendee. Yeah,
Yes, we would love
yeah,
you to come
really,
as an
really
attendee.
awesome.
Yeah, but like I said, I'm going to give it a couple more minutes in case anybody has any lingering questions. But if you don't, and you want to hop off, that's totally okay. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar here in just a couple minutes if no more questions come
And I'm gonna send you the list of papers right now so I don't forget.
in. Perfect. Perfect. Yes, we just have some thank yous coming in right now.
Oh, thank you guys for spending your lunch hour with us. All right.
Yes, and someone just asked for the evaluation and attendance confirmation. I will send out the evaluation in an email. So look out for that. And then I will also, I'm able to automatically confirm your attendance if you're asking about that for CEUs. Um, and then as usual, if you did request a CEU, I will get that to you in about next week. Definitely by next Friday, I'll be able to get that out to you. Alrighty. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye, y'all.